Sometimes it's kind of hard to answer those questions without repeating what the question is, but make sure that you're essentially just answering the question. Don't go into more detail than you need to. It's almost like less is more in this situation. I know sometimes it feels awkward to kind of just shut it off and have that moment of silence, but it's best to just stop versus continuing down a potential rabbit hole that could lead into questions that maybe you're not prepared for. Remember, you have the steering wheel, they have the gas pedal, but you have the steering wheel. So they're going to feed you these questions at a pace, and you again are steering and directing how you answer the questions. So everything that comes out of your mouth is fair game for them to question you further. So this is why preparation is really key, because you don't want to take your interview down a path that you have not prepared for or are not ready to discuss in more detail. Hey, future CRNA, do you have a CRNA interview that's quickly approaching? You're in luck. So in the past, I've heard students say, Jenny, I just didn't find you soon enough. And I will admit, there is a lot of information inside of CRNA School Prep Academy for you to get through. So much so that it can be overwhelming, especially if you're on a time crunch. So because of that, we have developed the CRNA Interview Crash Course, which again, if you're already a part of CRNA School Prep Academy, you have access to all the best resources you need and more. However, if you're limited on time and you're already not a CSBA student, but you need help with your interview preparation, we have developed this course just for you. What is included is the 5-day interview prep challenge, along with 3 mock interview replays, over 200 CRNA interview practice questions, and as a free bonus gift to you is an 88 CRNA clinical questions with answers study guide that's normally $27.99. So again, you can get all of this bundled into a fast track for your success on your upcoming CRNA interview, and you can purchase it in the show notes below. Cheers to your future. I'm rooting for your success. Now let's get back to the show. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to CRNA School Prep Academy podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Finnell. Welcome back to the show. I am excited to do this topic with you because I know interviews are quickly approaching. So today we're going to go over real CRNA interview questions. This was from a group panel mock interview that we did with several CRNA faculty. So these are direct questions that they were asked or students were asked during this group panel mock interview. So I would love to just review some of these questions with you and help provide you with some general feedback about how to answer them, as well as just some general interview tips. So let's go ahead and get into today's show. All right, future CRNA, let's get into some mock interview questions. October is a very busy month for interviews, which is right around the corner. So again, I'm hoping this episode is timely for you in your preparation for your own CRNA interview. Congratulations if you have an interview coming up. If you are anxiously awaiting your interview, I'm wishing you luck to get that golden ticket. And I definitely hope that you are actively preparing. Do not wait until you get asked or invited to interview. Make sure you're preparing at the time you submit your application. Because you never know how much notice you're going to get. I've had students tell me that they literally have days notice, while other schools may give you a month or two. You just sometimes don't know. So it's always best to prepare that you will have an interview. All right. So first tip for your CRNA school interview is to slow down, to make sure that you are pronunciating your words and making sure that you are understanding the question that is being asked. I know there's a lot of nerves that go into the interview process. So sometimes when you're under that kind of pressure, you maybe need to repeat what you think they're saying, so you make sure you understand the question at hand. It's really important to make sure that you are thoroughly answering the actual question versus going off on a tangent, because you may only have 20 minutes. And if you spend 5 minutes not actually answering their question, they're going to either move forward and not even ask you, and it could overall hinder your ability to have a successful interview. So you can always take a drink of water. That's a good way to take pauses. In fact, I'm going to do one right now. And you can bring that with you. That's definitely a good way to take that extra brief moment. And it can also help because, again, when you get anxious, sometimes you get dry mouth or gosh forbid, that tickle in your throat, where you have to cough. So again, having water is not a bad idea. You can also ask them again to repeat the question, or you yourself can repeat the question to make sure you're understanding what they're asking. You do want to make sure that you are not necessarily doing this every single time, because that can also slow down the interview. Use it when it's appropriate. I wouldn't use it as a default method of answering their questions. Use your own judgment. If it's a straightforward question and you got it, we'll go ahead and answer it. But if it's a more complex question that maybe has multiple steps, it's okay to answer one part at a time and make sure you're repeating the question, so you make sure you're answering all the parts. I think those can be really challenging. That can happen. And so sometimes it's kind of hard to answer those questions without repeating what the question is. But make sure that you're essentially just answering the question. Don't go into more detail than you need to. It's almost like less is more in this situation. I know sometimes it feels awkward to kind of just shut it off and have that moment of silence, but it's best to just stop versus continuing down a potential rabbit hole that could lead into questions that maybe you're not prepared for. Remember, you have the steering wheel, they have the gas pedal, but you have the steering wheel. So they're going to feed you these questions at a pace, and you again are steering and directing how you answer the questions. So everything that comes out of your mouth is fair game for them to question you further. So this is why preparation is really key, because you don't want to take your interview down a path that you have not prepared for or are not ready to discuss in more detail. So a question that they may ask you is, tell me about a time you had to say no. Now, when asked, you can maybe have several different directions with this question. One thing I want to warn you that could be seen as a negative is saying things like, well, I'm historically a people pleaser. Even if you are, that's okay, but that has a negative kind of association with it. And so again, that's probably not the best thing to label yourself as, even if you maybe have some traits around that. I think it's okay to say that, maybe historically you've had a hard time saying no to friends and family. But just like I've always kind of preached, what helped me, because I'm a people pleaser, right? Which I know, again, I wouldn't say in an interview, but you could always say, historically in the past, I've had a hard time saying no when asked to fulfill certain tasks or roles within my own life, whether that be friends, family, colleagues, peers. But what I've had to come to terms with is every time I say yes to someone, I'm equally saying no to something else. And sometimes those no's can be to self-care or my family. And so that has really helped me be able to say no more often and be able to prioritize what I say yes to. That's a great way to answer that. And technically that is because you're a people pleaser, right? But you don't necessarily have to label yourself as that. You can just essentially explain how you've overcome the kind of the pressure of saying no and how that makes you feel icky by realizing when you say no, you also, or when you say yes to something, you're also saying no. So it makes it easier to then say no, because you have to think about what else are you saying yes or no to in the process. I hope that helps. But again, I think that that's an okay way to answer the question. You just want to make sure that you're not labeling yourself negatively, and equally explaining how you have kind of overcome that hurdle as well. So again, think about time you had to say no. And it's like, for example, maybe that was in the ICU. I can think about plenty of times I've had to say no in the operating room setting. The most important part about saying no or even disagreeing with someone is just having your rationale. That is the most important aspect. So essentially, when you're telling this story of tell me about time you had to say no, it's important that you have a rationale that you used to openly communicate why you felt that way. And maybe that's advocating for the patient. Maybe that's because they didn't have a full picture of what you understood. So you helped explain that to give them the full picture so they could understand why you had to say no. So this is the type of response they're looking for, to make sure you're giving them some concrete rationale behind why you said no in that situation and kind of what the result was because of it. All right, let's move on. So another question is, tell me about the hardest skill set in the ICU that you've had to kind of overcome. So whether that's time management, whether that is saying no, or maybe advocating for your patient and kind of having that voice at the bedside, whatever it is, find a skill set that you found difficult when you were new in the ICU, and especially a skill set that you now have mastered, and share, why it was hard for you in the beginning and what you have done to overcome that and how you have now mastered that skill. Because again, they want to see your progress. They're looking for something that you found difficult that now you have been able to find a way to again improve upon. Because similarly, when you start CRNA school, there's going to be a lot of skill sets that you're going to find very difficult, but you can't just not try to master them. You have to master them. You have to be willing to work on your weaknesses. And so that is what they're looking for, is how have you done this in the past in the ICU? And potentially how can this relate to improving your ability to transition into the role of a nurse anesthesia resident? So that is the type of answer they're looking for. And again, we've had people say things like, maybe precepting was hard in the beginning, but why was that? And how is it going now? Maybe is the fact that you were frequently tripled with very critically sick patients, and, time management was very, very key. And not only time management, but prioritizing the patient's needs, and maybe explain how, you have been able to conquer that kind of challenge and how that has made you a better clinician as an ICU nurse, and how it will help you transition into the role of a nurse anesthesia resident. And similarly, precepting. How has precepting, even though maybe it was difficult in the beginning, because maybe you had to kind of slow down a little bit, right? Because typically when you do precept, it can slow you down. I know that's always been my thing. When I have a student, especially for a really busy day, I'm like, oh boy, okay. Not only do I have to watch them, explain to them, different steps and answer their questions, but I have to keep the pace. I have to make sure the room still goes. And so it can become an extra challenge, but in a good way, because it helps you not only effectively and efficiently precept, but it helps you equally have to stay on task. And so it is more of a challenge, and that can be very hard, especially in the beginning. I'll never forget, I was like out of school for a week, maybe like a new grad, and they gave me a student in my room, and I'm like, already? Really? You want me? And I was like, okay. So it felt like going from being a student to now all of a sudden I have a student. And that was really scary for me at first, because it felt very overwhelming. Like, I'm still trying to get my bearings. And here it is, I'm going to have to try to help them get their bearings. And, for the most part, what you do is you just do what you can. It's all about open communication, especially if you're in a busy room. Typically I start my mornings, and especially in a busy room, I let the student know ahead of time that, it's really important that we keep the pace, and this is why, and this is what to expect. And so I just set the tone from the very beginning, that it's not that I want to be short with you, or not that I don't want to thoroughly explain step by step if you need that, but there's going to be a time and place that we can do that. That's outside of the OR or in between cases. During the case, we're going to probably have to keep pace, and I will obviously try to let you do as much as you can, but if I have to jump in to make sure we're keeping pace, then I'm going to do that, because again, we have to keep the room moving. So I just am really open and honest with, that's the way this day is going to go. And it has nothing to do with the way I feel about you or your ability, but I ultimately have a responsibility to maintain the pace of the room, as the CRNA in the room. So that's kind of how I handle those situations, by just being open and communicating. And so when they're asking you questions like that, when you're precepting in the ICU, that would be a good way of you explaining how you handled those types of situations, and kind of were able to kind of combat those challenging scenarios where you're precepting and you have a really busy assignment. Okay. Next question that they could potentially ask you is, what would your preceptor say about you now? So this causes you to have some self-reflection. What would they say about you now? Meaning, what would they think about you in the beginning versus now? I think that's kind of what it's asking you to do, is saying, if they had to say what you're most improved on, or, that type of thing, that's kind of what they're looking for, is what would they say about you now? Meaning they've seen you develop over a period of 2, 3, 6 months. And what would they say about you now that they know you really well? So again, this is looking for you to self-reflect on your own growth throughout that time as a new ICU nurse, and kind of where where things left off when you were ending your own precepting time. So again, type of question that again is just asking you to self-reflect. Um, Make sure that your answer is purposeful and that you're not just going to ramble. Make sure you have a clear, concise idea in mind of what you accomplished during that precepting time and what your mentor or your preceptor complimented you on or told you did a great job on, or maybe even gave you critical feedback on that later down the road you had showed vast improvement on. Think about those things, and that's would be good things to keep it straight to the point, concrete. Again, make sure that when you're giving your responses that you're answering the question and then stopping, that you're not continuing to go on and on and on and ramble. Give specific examples. Is more specific, the better. This is why it's really nice ahead of your interview to just jot down actual concrete examples of real life practice that have happened to you, because it's really hard to think about those things on the spot. You want to have concrete examples to give them to paint a really clear picture so they can literally think the way you're thinking and put themselves in the situation that you were in mentally. So think about what you would want if someone's telling you a story. When you're telling us, it's just telling a story. You want to make sure you have very specific examples. Otherwise, it's hard to visualize what they're telling you. So, an answer that was given was that they are now more moldable than when they were first started. So this could be, let me show an example of how I was able to be more flexible in a clinical scenario where maybe I'd never had this type of patient before, but because I had had X, Y, and Z experience, I was able to adapt to this new situation very quickly and take a new admit while my preceptor was very busy tending to her other very sick patient. Whatever the story is, again, think of really concrete examples of this is what happened. This is why I know I'm more moldable or more flexible now than I was in the beginning, because I felt more confident taking X type of patient when prior to that, I probably would have felt uncomfortable or I would have needed more help to manage this type of a patient. All right. Next question is, tell me about a time on the unit that you had to think fast and what you did about it. So this is a two-part question. Tell me about a time you had to think fast and what you did about it. So again, they're asking for a time that you had to make a very quick split second decision, and then how you handled yourself during that split second decision. And again, you will be doing this all the time as an anesthesia provider. A lot of what we do is making very quick judgment calls in the OR and really trying to troubleshoot what's the cause and then taking quick action to make sure you're making sure whatever could potentially be occurring doesn't progress and become more severe. Another example I can give you that happened recently was during a colonoscopy. My patient vagaled. Now, they were already slow in the 50s when they started. They were healthy teenager athlete. But when they dropped in the 40s, I immediately knew, especially the low 40s, I immediately knew I was going to have to take some action. So I quickly told the surgeon that they were insufflating the bowel and that the patient was vagaling down. By the time I had given Robenal, I just started with 0.1. They were already in the 30s. So I gave and then they dropped to the 20s. So it progressed very quickly. Had I not seen that trend, or maybe had my back turned to the patient, maybe I wouldn't have noticed it as quickly. So again, the fact that I was paying attention, knowing that they were insufflating, knowing they were going around that curve in the bowel, that's usually when the vagal response occurs. I was watching that and seeing the downward trend and saying, okay, I got to take action now, because patients can go asystolic from that. I have seen that happen too, and it can happen very quick. So that's an example in the operating room. But again, think about things in the ICU setting that you've had to make really quick judgment calls and maybe do some active communication or advocacy for your patients that needed a very quick resolution. I know you can think of several, so just jot them down and take notes on that. This person gave an example of calling out for help for a patient who was desatting, and then actively taking action to remediate the situation, meaning giving them oxygen and sitting their head bed up. And it ended up happening, the patient actually aspirated, and again, doing a thorough assessment to figure out what caused this really acute desat saturation and kind of going from there. So that was a scenario they played out in this question. But again, think of your own example and just make sure it's really precise and to the point. I think and then what they liked about that response too is you're not afraid to ask for help, and similarly, like in the OR, if my patient had gone asystolic, you better believe that, I would have had the attending at the bedside, because typically when you stop insufflation, things like that, I've never had someone stay asystolic, but drugs won't work. Meaning if you're giving, atropine and they're completely asystolic, they're going to need chest compressions to circulate that atropine. So usually removing the stimulation helps break that vagal, but you got to think about that too, because again, if you're giving drugs and your heart's not pumping, what are the drugs going to do besides sit in your vein? So again, making sure you're calling reinforcements, because now you could be potentially running a code and need all hands on deck. So again, thinking about like what would be next and calling for help and making sure that you're getting reinforcements to provide the extra support you may hopefully not need, but calling them ahead of time is always key, because they could not be there at an instant. They might take a minute or two to get there. And a minute or two during a code situation feels like a very long time. Even a minute feels like a long time during a code. So, all right. And usually it doesn't take that long to get, if you're really in that dire straits, you usually have like 10 people in your room in like 15 seconds, but you just never know sometimes. I know as a CRNA, sometimes I was off an EP lab, which was way down past the operating room. I mean, if you were walking briskly, it would probably take you a solid 2 minutes to get there. And that doesn't seem like a long time, but when you're in a bad situation by yourself, 2 to 3 minutes is a very long time. So again, it was always kind of one of those things where you had to make sure you were calling out very early and anticipating needing the extra set of hands, even if they showed up and you're like, oh, false alarm. It was better to have them show up and have it be a false alarm than have them be delayed getting to a very critical situation. And now you're in there managing it by yourself when things could have gone way smoother had you had an extra set of skilled hands. So those types of things really can make or break the situation. So again, it's always better to be proactive in that approach and express that whatever situation you can think of that you've experienced in the ICU, make sure you're expressing that and sharing that story. All right. Another question that they could ask you is, tell me about a favorite drip in the unit and why. Now, the student answering this question, picked Levo because they were typically, watching things like cardiac index and cardiac output. They didn't go into too much detail on how Levo worked. They kind of just said it was a good drug to really help the cardiac output, and that's why they picked it, and kind of ended it there. The feedback was essentially like, they would, okay, that's it. You're right. It does help the cardiac output. But they want to know why, like what is down in how does the mechanism of Levo help the cardiac output? They're looking for, what receptors it affects and, maybe beta more than alpha or alpha more than beta, dose dependent. They wanted more details. And then what dose would you start them on versus how would you titrate it? They wanted those types of very detailed responses to see that you have a true understanding of how the drug actually functions as the mechanism of action and how you would actually be dosing and using the drug. So that was the recommendation from there. And again, that was one of those things where I think that it was just like kind of caught off the spot. And maybe I'm sure this person probably knew, but maybe they were afraid to go into too much detail because they were afraid they would mess it up. But this is where preparation can really help you, because if you know in your mind that if they ask you about a drug, you're going to pick Levophed, well, then you can confidently prepare yourself to answer that question in detail. So when they do ask you that question, you can feel comfortable going into more detail without shying away from it. Because I have a feeling the student just shied away from it because they got nervous, right? But I have a feeling they probably knew, but they were afraid if they messed it up, it would be worse. So I think it's important to pick a drug, one drug, maybe two drugs that you want to know by the back of your hand. Of course, you should know more than two drugs, but I'm just saying, pick a couple drugs that, remember, you're driving the steering wheel, you're driving the direction of the interview. Pick a couple drugs that like the back of your hand and very, very well. Now, if they randomly pick a drug that you haven't prepared for, most time they let you steer. But if they just randomly pick milrinone, for example, and that was not in your wheelhouse, then you do the best you can and make sure that you, again, just tell them what you do know versus just saying, I don't know. Tell them what you do know about milrinone and then end it there versus just saying, I white flag, I didn't prepare for that. kind of thing. Know that they focus a lot on ACLS drugs and then typical drugs that you would typically use as drips in the ICU. So they do tend to steer to those types of drugs versus random drugs. However, I have heard students being asked about heparin, about insulin, and other kind of more, I mean, they're common drugs, but people don't think about them because they're not cardiovascular drugs, right? So knowing that any drip that you use in the ICU could be fair game, including things like heparin and insulin.
Hey, future CRNA, another daily dose of inspiration along your CRNA journey. This success story starts with these words. With all the happiness in the world, I am so excited to say I was accepted into CRNA School, into my top choice school. My journey has been a roller coaster, to say the least. I'm so blessed for this amazing opportunity. Thank you, CRNA School Prep Academy, for all your amazing resources. Your support resources have helped me during every step of this process. I wish everyone on their journey all the strength and positivity. I say with the utmost certainty that if you want it, you will get there. If you envision it, you will have it. I'm going to be a CRNA, you guys. I can't stop crying. So I wanted to share this because some really inspirational words and motivation from the student is that if you envision it, you will become it. If you believe, you will achieve. And while I know some of you may be full of fear and doubt, this is the transition that needs to occur in your CRNA journey. Really, we're unstoppable as human beings. If we really want something, we will go after it at no avail, right? So I hope that that leaves you with this positive reinforcement that you are doing your best. And as long as you keep showing up, you're going to find success. So no matter what experiences you think may hold you back, just embrace it, face it head on. You can do this. I'm rooting for you. Let's get back to the show.
All right. Why should we choose you? That's a very common question. And, some people don't really have anything great to say. And that's kind of like deflating the balloon. It's like you do good for this whole interview and the balloon's growing and growing and growing. They're like, whoo. And then they ask you, why should you choose you? And you're like, you don't have anything to say. And it's like, they just pop the balloon. It's like, oh, that kind of just a letdown. So make sure you have something thoughtful to say about yourself. This is when it's okay to brag and you have to be comfortable doing that. And I thought this was great. The student who answered this question, went into the fact that, kind of who they are as a person and the fact that they were a hard worker and that they knew they were going to be representing their program and they would make sure that they, held true to that representation during their time in clinical, which they love to hear because that is very true. When you're in clinical, and you're going to X program, if you're not showing up to clinical prepared, if you are giving them attitude and having problems, it kind of gives the program a bad rap. And then they have to deal with the ramifications of that. So hearing the student be aware of that shows a lot of, emotional intelligence and self-awareness that, not only are they taking ownership for themselves, but they also are taking ownership for how they're portraying the program. So I thought that was a great way to answer that. And again, the program faculty, like, eyes lit up. They're like, "Ooh, I love this. This was great." To hear them, not just take self-ownership, but to realize that they're representing their school. So that was a great way to answer that. But again, why should you choose you? I mean, it could be other reasons too. I've had students say things like, I feel like I'd be a good asset to your cohort because of X, Y, and Z. Maybe it's because you have PICU experience and you feel like you would add a lot of knowledge base to the cohort, or maybe you used to be a tutor for some, for the Student Nurse Association or whatever it is, whatever kind of leadership role you've played in the past. You can highlight that at this point and stress how you feel like you would be a good asset in their program, that you would be doing these types of things for other peers in your cohort. Just keep in mind too, they're picking you for their cohort. They're picking you for you, but they want to know, how are you going to be special? How are you going to be different? Why should we pick you over someone else? Because like I've spoke to it before, is, they might have 30 people they really, really want, and they can only take 15. And it doesn't mean those 15 other people are not qualified or not great or candidates, but they ultimately are picking a cohort. So why should, out of those 15, if everything's equal to equal and they want you all, but they just can't take you all, why should they pick you? Think about that and write those reasons down and have a good example to give them as far as why that is. Why our program? So good things, are things like missions, the mission statement, and how, your values correlate with their values and their mission. Clinical sites, could be another good one. Be careful with saying location. They've stressed this, and location, yes, obviously, if it's in your backyard, convenient, right? But they want to hear something more in depth than that. Maybe it's not really, if you really think about why is location so important, other than the fact that it's convenient and you don't have to go very far or spend extra money to travel, it's probably more about you having your support system there, whether that be your significant other, your family, whatever it may be. So give them that reason versus just saying location. That they understand that support is important and they know you need support. So again, that's better, a better rationale than just saying location, period, because truly the meaning behind location is support. So just go into the support aspect of it instead. And make sure you have an order to your whys. Make sure you don't just randomly list your whys. Make sure you have a rationale as to why this is the most important, next, third, fourth. And these are my reasons. And I have a rationale as to why this is the most important thing, followed by this and this and this. It just shows more thought than just picking random reasons. Yeah, that's probably my biggest recommendation is pick things that are meaningful to the program versus more, I should say, they're not shallow, because that's not what I mean by that. And it sounds kind of bad saying that, because we're all human. We want cost effectiveness, we want location, and things of that nature. But just make sure you have a little bit more in-depth reasons as to why you're picking the school versus just cost and location. Because again, it just doesn't feel good to hear, well, I'm only picking you because you're cheap and because you're in my backyard. They're like, oh, really? So I don't know. Just think about it from their perspective on why, like, what's a meaty why you're picking us versus like kind of more of like a surface level why. All right. Next question could be, do you know what a CRNA does? And, sometimes this question, I've heard them say some kind of radical things where I'm like, whoa, where patients, I say patients, where, candidates maybe say things like, well, yeah, of course I know what a CRNA does, or just, gets defensive about it. It's not meant to offend you. It's just a really humble question of asking you, can you tell me what a CRNA does so we can confirm that you've done your research on why you're sitting here versus you looked up on Google and they make a lot of money and now you want to do it. Sign me up. They want to know you understand what you're getting yourselves into, because they know that school is rigorous and hard. And if you're not, money only takes you so far at the end of the day. What actually really drives results in your life is always passion. Yeah, you typically try to make money in your life, but if it's making money that you're not passionate about and how to get there, you're more than likely going to fizzle out. Typically, passion is what drives results. And so they want to see the passion, which means you understand what you're getting yourself into and you understand the role of a CRNA, and they want to hear you explain what that is. Okay. What questions do you have for me? This is another question that is commonly asked. And if you don't have anything to say, it's like popping that balloon. Make sure you have some questions. And again, not questions that are directly from their website, or sometimes these schools will give you kind of a open house walkthrough of their program prior to the interview. That can be hard because they tend to answer a lot of questions that you may have on your list and you're like, oh no. So again, think about things that are a little bit outside the box that are not typical. Some that were mentioned during this session, which I thought were great, were having you ask the faculty, tell me what your favorite part about your program is. And again, maybe they mention this in their walkthrough. Well, then, okay. Another question that said, well, what is your favorite part about being, or what is your favorite part about being a CRNA? That's a great question. That's probably not something they would have told you during the walkthrough open house, but that's a really great question. And it just shows curiosity, insightfulness, and excitement for the profession. So both those are good options, but again, doesn't mean whatever you have your list is wrong, but just make sure you have several, because again, sometimes they could be answering these questions during the pre-interview portion, and it would look silly if you asked the question that they actually answered. So this is also why it's good if you have that type of interview coming up where you're going to be having a walkthrough open house, and they'll let you know. Bring a little binder or notepad with you so you make sure that you're taking notes during that intro session that they have for you, to make sure you're remembering, because it might be hard to, if you're just listening, which is great to listen, but you might forget some things and you might not realize they have answered questions that are on your list to ask the program at the end of the interview. Also keep in mind, keep it brief. You don't want to have a laundry list of questions, 1 to 2 max. They don't have, 15 minutes to answer a bunch of questions. So again, make sure you're keeping that list concise. Now, having several questions to pick from is always good to have a bank, but make sure you have the top 2 that you want to ask. And the other ones are more just like backup, right? They're just backup in case your other questions are not what you end up wanting to ask because maybe they answered them or et cetera, et cetera. And equally so, if you had all your questions answered, let them maybe, because sometimes they put current nurse anesthesia residents to kind of help orient you during that walkthrough. And part of their job or their role during that day is to help answer your questions. So maybe you got some questions answered by them. You could equally let the faculty know that these were the questions you had, but you were able to talk to and say they know their name and that they informed you that this was the answer and that you're really grateful for that, and to see if there's anything else the faculty could add to that answer. That's equally okay, because maybe you had a burning question, but you actually got it answered by one of their residents. And that just shows that you took initiative to ask it, which is a good thing. And you could ask them to see if they have anything to add to it. So again, it's not doomsday if your questions were all taken. I want to reiterate that too, that you can still spin it into a positive, that you were taking an active approach and trying to find out your answers to your questions. All right. Next would be, this is a tip. Be careful about saying There's other things you could say other than that's probably the most common thing, because again, it's more of a filler. I'm guilty of it. Oh my gosh. If you guys go back to some of the first podcast episodes, it's so cringy. I still do it on occasion because it's just like, oops, it just comes out. But it's funny, and I just said it, right? I just said it. My husband pointed it out because he was listening to the podcast episodes, and he actually does a lot of our emails for CSBA. And he was like, Jenny, you need to get your ums in check. This is really bad. So it was really insightful that I was not even aware I was doing it. So now I'm more cognizant when I do it, but it's still, it's to take some self-awareness to do that, and a lot of practice, a lot of trial and error to try to alleviate that. But try to figure out whether you're using filler words and try to practice being aware of it. Because the only way to really combat that is to actually be aware that you're using the filler words. And a lot of times that comes from maybe not being able to finish your thought or being in thought. And so when you're in thought, you automatically say the word because you're thinking, but know that silence is equally okay versus using a filler word. Another question that you could be asked are you applying to other programs? I think this question makes students nervous because they're like, oh, what do I say? Do I admit that I'm applying to several other schools? Are you applying to other programs? I think ultimately you don't have to say who or what school you're applying to. That's not necessarily really any of their business, but they're clearly curious if you're applying to other schools. So you don't want to lie and say, no, I'm not, if you are. But again, you don't have to say I'm applying to this university and this university and this university. You could just say, yes, I'm applying to 3 other schools. And, my considerations are based on the following factors. And have a list similar to why you were picking that program. Have a list of like, I have 3 other schools and this is my considering factors on why I chose these schools. And, you're my number 1 choice because of this. Right. And whether or not they're your number 1, I kind of think it would be bad to say, oh, you're my number 3, but this school and this school's my number 1. And here's why. I think you should lean into the fact that, you're obviously trying to get into CRNA school, and whether or not it is your number 1 or not, I think you should reassure them that you're clearly interested in attending their program. They did also mention that if you're not interested in their program, to just not waste their time. And also keep in mind, you're taking this interview spot from someone else. So if you genuinely have no intention of accepting a seat in that program, that maybe interviewing with them is really just not the right thing to do. Now, I know I've practiced, getting practice rounds in before your number 1 school, but I don't think it's necessary to interview at a school that you would literally have no intent of actually attending. I think you should just make sure that if you have a number 1, 2, and 3, that you're interviewing at your number 3 school first, so get kind of a practice round. Your number 1 school, save it kind of for the best for last, but equally be okay with accepting your number three school and having a reason why they would be a choice for you as your number one kind of thing. So again, because again, nobody wants to hear that they're not top on your list if you're sitting there in the interview seat. And you don't have to say you're my number one choice. You don't even have to, you could just omit it. You could just say, this is my considerations, and this is why you're on my, like, this school's on my list. And then I have X school and X school, and this is why those are on my list. And then you can just leave it at that. You don't have to order them of any kind or anything like that. Okay. Another question would be, in preparation for CRNA school, tell me about one of your favorite classes. So this is looking into in your undergrad time and your preparation up until you started your CRNA program or you're interviewing for a CRNA program. Tell me what your favorite class has been and why. So, if I was asked this question, I love pharmacology and I love pathophysiology. Those are both my number one and number two courses. But I think if I had to pick a favorite, I'd pick pathophysiology because I really like the fact that they're all interconnected. And I like the fact that pathophysiology is kind of like a puzzle where that you have to solve when you have multiple comorbidities that are playing together and trying to figure out the cause and effect of what's actually happening and then how you treat that. So that would have been what I would have shared. But again, pick something that you can speak passionately to and why. But again, they're just kind of getting they're trying to dig to see like what your true interests are and why that would be. Someone who did answer this said that they loved biology because they loved the hands-on aspect of it. And they had a really great professor who taught it, which again is a great answer. Biology is probably not as relatable to anesthesia as pharmacology or pathophysiology, but the fact that they loved hands-on, that's a good sign because you will be very hands-on in CRNA school. So you can relate it to that and speak to it from there as well. So again, it's just to have something in mind to speak to as far as what your favorite subjects are and why, and maybe how that relates to your future in anesthesia. Another tip is to not ask for feedback during the interview. We had someone ask this, which I'm glad they had a chance to ask, because this is just not an appropriate use of their time. I know you want to know, and there hopefully will be an opportunity for you to get feedback. Hopefully you'll get into school and you won't need to ask for feedback unless you really just want to know. But I know this is a pain point for a lot of students because they've interviewed before and they don't get in, they don't get any feedback, or at least it's not good feedback. It's just like, well, it was competitive cycle, try again. It's like, well, that doesn't really help me. I need specific things I can do to better my application. So I get you want to know, but at the same time, again, this is not the most appropriate time for you to be asking for specific feedback on how you did on the interview. So that was a statement that I want to make sure I shared. All right, we're winding this down with the last question that I have for you guys to keep in mind that they could be asking you, which is, tell me about the most difficult part of CRNA, what you think the most difficult part of CRNA school would be and why. And again, this just shows that you're taking some initiative and thinking through what's ahead of you, and making sure that, again, you've thought this out and maybe how you plan to handle that. So if that's time management, if that's study techniques, what have you actively done to practice or brush up on those things? If it's, maybe the pressure and the stress of performing, well, how are you going to handle that? If that is going to be the most difficult thing that you're going to experience in CRNA school, that may be concerning because you are going to be in a lot of pressure under stress. Is that going to make you crack? So think about what would be the most difficult thing and what you're actively doing or have already actively done or plan on doing to alleviate that potential difficulty or hurdle that you're going to be facing. They're just looking for a proactive approach on this. They're looking for you to have thoroughly thought, well, I do think this is going to be hard, but this is what I plan to do about it. That type of response. And then I guess one more thing I want to throw out there that they commonly do ask you sometimes is, what have you done to prepare financially or to not work over the next 3 years, stuff like that. They want to make sure that you have thoroughly thought out, how you plan on paying for CRNA school and that you're going to have a budget and maybe to cut back on things. So have a thoughtful, concise, to the point, remember, not rambling, but concise and to the point response on how you have planned to manage your finances during CRNA school. Maybe you have a spouse that works and you can get on his medical insurance and he's going to be able to support the majority of the bills. And you've also cut out cable. You're not going out to eat anymore. You've cut back on your Starbucks. You plan on packing lunch, you have your car paid off, and what you've paid off all your credit cards. What have you actively done to make your time in CRNA school financially more successful? So it has some action items that you have actively done. All right. Well, that sums up this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope it helps you in your upcoming CRNA interviews. I'm rooting for you. Make sure you let me know. I want to hear from you. I love celebrating with you. It's one of the funnest things that I get to do is to celebrate success with you. And remember that if you get a no, no doesn't mean never. There's always going to be a next time. Keep your chin up. You're working hard. I'm proud of you. And thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you guys next week. All right. Bye-bye. Hey, future CRNA, as always, I appreciate you and your loyalty. Thank you so very much for tuning in this week. I'd love to hear from you, so screenshot this episode and share it to your IG stories with your biggest takeaway. Don't forget to tag me at CRNA School Prep Academy so I can personally thank you. Be sure to head over to CRNASchoolPrepAcademy.com to check out our blog and gather free resources to help you along your CRNA journey. Stay strong, and I'll see you next week.